Sure, we've been talking a lot about how the Republicans in Capitol Hill are trying to pull suppressors, short barrel rifles, and short barrel shotguns out of the National Firearms Act, which I applaud and I cheer for. The question becomes, somebody posed this to me in one of the comments, hey Mark, what happens if the Democrats get back into power and they decide to pass a reconciliation bill that actually puts all these items back in the National Firearms Act, except this time with a $10,000 tax stamp for each? What would happen? Well, we're going to talk about that when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Done, a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, so we obviously are cheering. We got our toes crossed, our fingers crossed, our candles lit, that the Republicans on Capitol Hill get together and pass the big, beautiful bill that Donald Trump is pushing for, which would include removing suppressors, short barrel rifles, and short barrel shotguns out of the National Firearms Act entirely. That would be fantastic, and that's what I'm cheering for. But a couple people have raised a very interesting question in the comments to my videos on the big, beautiful bill and the National Firearms Act, and that is this. What happens if the Democrats get back into power? They control the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they go out there and they use a reconciliation bill, which avoids a Republican filibuster in the U.S. Senate. And they use a reconciliation bill to put back into the National Firearms Act short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and suppressors. And who knows what else? And they use reconciliation to put all those items back into the National Firearms Act. And then, to make matters worse for the Second Amendment community, they decide to impose a $10,000 tax stamp for each item. What would happen? What would happen? It's a great question that the commentators have raised in my prior videos. So I want to address that. Well, what would happen exactly? Well, assuming that that law were to be enacted and the Democrats put back in these three items into the NFA with a $10,000 tax stamp per item, along with the registration requirements and everything else, how do we analyze this? Well, we would analyze this by applying the Second Amendment, Heller and Bruin and the like. And what does that mean? You know what it means. We start out with the text of the Second Amendment, and then we would move to see if there's a historical tradition of firearms regulation that would warrant or justify this law. So let's start textually. Well, this should be pretty straightforward. Textually, a suppressor, short barrel rifle, and short barrel shotgun, these are all arms. Even a suppressor is an arm. The Department of Justice says it's an arm. We've talked about this, that if you restrict, regulate, or ban, or tax, or any of the above, a suppressor, or a magazine for that matter, what have you done? You have restricted, taxed, banned, regulated a firearm that is capable of firing suppressed rounds, or firing more than 10 rounds without needing to be reloaded. So if you restrict or regulate a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds, or you restrict or regulate a suppressor, you're not only restricting or regulating that item, you're also restricting and regulating firearms that, with that item, function a particular way, either by shooting more than 10 rounds without reloading, or again, firing suppressed rounds. So it's actually a firearms regulation, not just a regulation on a standalone accessory or standalone item, a standalone instrument, a standalone object, whatever you want to call it. So in light of the fact that textually such a tax and registration requirement on these items or these firearms would be a government restriction on arms, the text of the Second Amendment would be implicated. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And because the text has been implicated by the regulation and restriction of these items, you know what happens. The burden shifts to the government. The burden shifts to the government to show historical analog laws that would allow them to engage in this restrictive conduct, these restrictive laws of these items. And could they succeed in doing so? So once we shift to history, we then have to ask ourselves, can the government ban or restrict these items? And the only way they could do so constitutionally is if the government, the federal government in this case, could prove and satisfy its burden of proof that short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and suppressors are not in common use, Because the government, in order to do this restriction, do this regulation, do this ban, do this taxation, they have to demonstrate that these arms are not protected under the Second Amendment. And since they cannot do it as a matter of text, as a matter of linguistics or semantics, they would have to do it using history, which means they have to demonstrate that these arms are somehow dangerous and unusual. And in order to do that, they would have to show that these weapons, these arms, are not in common use by Americans for lawful purposes, because if they are in common use by Americans for lawful purposes, they are by definition not dangerous and unusual. And the burden of proof in all of this lies not with the Second Amendment rights claimant, but with the government itself. Now, once we turn to history, we then have to find out, are these weapons in common use? And the answer is undeniably are. We already know that when it comes to suppressors, for example, and the NFA registration list, today, there's over 3, maybe 4 million suppressors in the United States right now. If you pull them out of the NFA and you stop imposing a $200 tax and a registration requirement with the ATF to prove you paid the tax stamp, you remove all those obstacles and hurdles away from Americans and the ability to acquire suppressors, you're going to have an explosion in the sale of suppressors. So that by the time that the Democrats got back into power, which at the earliest would be after Donald Trump leaves office in 2028, at the earliest, you're going to have probably double the number of short barrel rifles, double the number of short barrel shotguns, double the number of suppressors, right? So when the Democrats were to do this regulation and impose and put these things back into the NFA, we in the Second Amendment community would have clear constitutional claims that the restrictions under the NFA of these 3 items are unconstitutional, because if these items are protected arms under the Second Amendment, we know they are textually, then the question is, if they cannot be shown to be dangerous and unusual, which they won't, the government will not be able to prove that, then they're protected arms. And if they're protected arms, not only can they not be banned, see Heller, but they cannot be hit with a targeted tax, right? If suppressors, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns are protected arms under the Second Amendment, both textually, and the government cannot show they're dangerous or unusual, which they will not be able to prove, and then you hit them with a $10,000 or even a $1 tax on these items, what have you done? You have violated the clear Supreme Court precedent that says targeted taxes, targeted taxation on protected Second Amendment arms is unconstitutional. You'll run square into, right? The Democrats would run square into the Harper versus Board of Elections case from the 1960s that says a $1.50 poll tax is unconstitutional. And you run square into the Minneapolis Star case that says a targeted tax on ink used by newspapers in the state of Minnesota is unconstitutional because it's a targeted tax in that case on the right to free speech and the right to a free press under the First Amendment. So again, assuming for the sake of argument that the government is not able to show that these items, suppressors and the short barrel items, are assuming the government cannot show they're dangerous and unusual weapons, which over the next few years, if the Second Amendment community buys several million of all of these items, for example, then yeah, it would further cement the commonality of these arms. And if they are in common use, they are protected arms and cannot be banned by states, for example, and they cannot be taxed under the NFA, for example, and they cannot be otherwise regulated because, again, they are protected arms that are in common use by Americans for lawful purposes. And again, remember, never forget that when you're dealing with the in common use test, the burden to show that an arm is not in common use is on the government. Never screw this up. The anti-gunners want you to make this methodological mistake. Don't do it. Because the in common use test derives itself from the historical tradition of regulating dangerous and unusual weapons, and that comes from history and the historical traditions, it is part of the historical burden where the burden is on whom? The government, right? Once the burden shifts to the government to do the history, the burden is on the government, which means the burden is on the government to show that these arms are not in common use. And they cannot do it. The Second Amendment rights claimant need only sit on his dupa and look out the window at the clouds go by as the government tries to show these weapons are not in common use by Americans for lawful purposes, which they simply are not possibly able to do. And I'm not saying that you don't want to prove or show that these weapons are in common use, but the point is, legally speaking, the government bears the burden to show they're not in common use in the same way the government bears the burden to show that you are committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And the criminal defendant doesn't have to do anything, doesn't have to testify, doesn't have to call a witness, doesn't have to do anything, because the burden is entirely upon the government. In a criminal case, so too is the burden entirely upon the government. In a Second Amendment case, once you move into the historical analysis, and that includes demonstrating that arms are not in common use by Americans for lawful purposes, and thus they are dangerous and unusual. All of this is the burden of proof on the government, period, full stop. So in short, if the Democrats get back into power and they put the short barrel rifles and shotguns back into the NFA and suppressors back into the NFA with a $10,000 tax stamp for each, as one of my commentators astutely observed and asked, they would fail because the millions of these things would be owned by Americans, and therefore they would be in common use by Americans for lawful purposes. And because of that, they cannot be deemed dangerous and unusual. And as a result of that, they cannot be restricted or regulated, banned, or taxed for the reasons we've just talked about. So that's the answer to that very interesting question. And I hope this helps you analyze Second Amendment cases moving forward, including these items. And by the way, as a side note, a lot of people have said several states have banned suppressors, for example. And the truth is, those, in my opinion, are going to be very, very susceptible to a Second Amendment challenge because I don't see how they're going to stand. And they will only add sort of further persuasiveness, if you will, that suppressors are no longer regulated under the NFA. I think it will strengthen those Second Amendment arguments in all respects. But yes, indeed, I think those state-based bans on suppressors and the like are probably not long for this world. But again, the history of the future has yet to be written. So there you have it, folks. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxesdiner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.